Good afternoon. Welcome to the American Antiquarian Society's program, Phillis Wheatley Peters in Material Memory. AAS is located on the ancestral homelands of the Nipmuc tribal community, who remain in active presence here in central Massachusetts. My name is Nan Wolverton, Vice President for Academic and Public Programs at the Society. I'm going to keep my remarks today very brief because we have a lot to share with you today. But we do have a very large audience, and I know that we have people who have not attended one of our programs before. So I'm just going to say very briefly that we are a national research library of printed and manuscript materials that date to before 1900, and that we welcome researchers from around the world to use our collections, both physical and digital. You can go to our website to learn more about us. I will also say that we host programs like this one that feature aspects of our collections and provide insights into the past and that have resonance for our own day. Amanda Condick, Programs Coordinator, is going to be posting links and relevant information in the chat. You may see that already. We will get to all of your questions later in the program, and just know that you should use the Q&A feature for that. And you can type questions in at any point during the program. And also know that this program is being recorded and will be available on YouTube very soon, next week. This year marks the 250th publication anniversary of Phillis Wheatley Peters' poems on various subjects, religious and moral. Throughout this anniversary year, a project directed by the University of Georgia and Texas Christian University titled The Genius of Phillis Wheatley Peters, A Poet and Her Legacies, honors the anniversary, and our program is just one in that year-long series of programs. The co-directors of that project, Barbara McCaskill and Sarah Ruffing, are with us this afternoon. Our program is part of our own series titled Women Make History. I'm going to introduce each of the speakers in order of appearance, and then we'll get started with the presentations. You can find longer versions of their bios on our website, so feel free to do that. But in the interest of time, I'm going to go through these fairly quickly. And I am absolutely delighted to start by introducing a very special guest joining us today. Honorée Fanonne Jeffers is a poet, writer, and essayist. She is professor of English at the University of Oklahoma. She's the author of 5 books of poetry, most recently, The Age of Phillis and The Love Songs of W.E.B. Du Bois. The Age of Phillis was longlisted for the 2020 National Book Award in Poetry. She has received 2 Lifetime Achievement notations, including induction into the Alabama Writers Hall of Fame. Jeffers was a Barron Creative and Performing Artist and Writers Fellow here at AAS back in 2009, and she was elected to membership in 2014. Barbara McCaskill is Professor of English at the University of Georgia and Associate Academic Director at the Wilson Center for Humanities and Arts. Her most recent books are Love, Liberation and Escaping Slavery, William and Ellen Craft in Cultural Memory, The Magnificent Reverend Peter Thomas Stanford, a Transatlantic Activist and Raceman. She is co-principal investigator of culture and community at the Penn Center National Historic Landmark District, a multi-year collaboration funded by the Mellon Foundation. Sarah Ruffing Robbins is Lorraine Shirley Professor of Literature at Texas Christian University. Coordinator of numerous grant-funded public humanities initiatives, she has published 10 academic books, including 2 informed by research at the AAS. The Choice Award-winning Managing Literacy, Mothering America, and Learning Legacies, Archive to Action Through Women's Cross-Cultural Teaching. Sarah began her academic career as a secondary school teacher and continues to collaborate with K-12 educators in participatory humanities initiatives, including the National Writing Project's NEH-funded Building a More Perfect Union project that has supported dozens of local humanities programs around the country. Ashley Cataldo is Curator of Manuscripts at the American Antiquarian Society, and you will hear more about Ashley's experience later in the program. And I'm also happy to introduce Elizabeth Watts Popes, who is Curator of Books and Digitized Collections at the Society. And again, you'll hear from both of these curators and more about their own backgrounds and experience when we get to the Q&A portion of the show. Honorée we'll turn it over to you.
Good afternoon. And thank you so much for having me here virtually at the American Antiquarian Society, or as I like to call it, my happy place. I came to the American Antiquarian Society in July 2009 as a Barron Artist Fellow. I arrived for the purposes of writing poems imagining Miss Phillis's life and times. Before I arrived, I'd explored digital primary collections online, and I'd read extensively the writings of Catherine Clay Bassard, Vincent Coretta, Henry Louis Gates Jr., and too many others to mention in this brief time. Here are some of the highlights of my time at the AAS. Caroline Sloat was my mentor and gave me amazing guidance at the Fellows Luncheons she generously attended. Elizabeth Watts Pope allowed me to touch the desk that had belonged to Mary Wheatley. Ashley Cataldo showed me the website of the letters of Timothy Fitch, the owner of the slave ship that brought the child renamed Phillis Wheatley to these shores. I hailed a first edition of poems on various subjects, religious and moral, and I cried. There were sobering moments too, as when I realized that the so-called biography of Phillis Wheatley Peters, memoir and poems of Phillis Wheatley contained lies about John Peters, the husband of Miss Phillis. It is my belief that the authorship of this so-called biography is still not settled. At the urging of Caroline Sloat, I traveled to Waltham to the Northeast National Archives. There I encountered John Peters' name beside his race and free status on the Suffolk County Census Report of 1790. And even after I'd concluded my fellowship, Ashley Cataldo sent me the item about the publishing agreement between John Peters and Isaiah Thomas for Miss Phillis's second book of poetry. In March 2020, I was honored to be the first to publish about this in The Age of Phillis. It's in the notes. There is so much I remain excited about, but let me say that I would not be here on this panel at my place in my writing career or at the level of full endowed professor at my university if not for the advice, guidance, or writing of the brilliant people I have mentioned, and so many I don't have space to mention, but who I cite in the bibliography of my book. I call their names because as an Africana person, I was taught to give respect to those whose scholarship helped me along the way, even if those scholars actually are younger than I am. And even when scholars are not from Africana communities, when they write on Africana subjects, in effect, they enter an Africana space. Thus, I believe they should make sure to respect, acknowledge, and cite those who completed previous scholarship in the field. And it doesn't matter what race, gender, age, or power positionality those previous scholars might inhabit. Again, it's about respect and culture. When we do not respect Africana cultural practices, we run the risk of doubling down on white supremacist tendencies of others in centuries gone by. Those who believed that by owning the materials of Black subjects, they also owned the right to tell those subject stories in ways that effectively rendered them re-enslaved, even in death. Thank you so very much. And now I'm honored to turn over to Dr. Barbara McCaskill.
Thank you, Honorée, for those powerful remarks. I'm just going to share my screen. During the first half of the 19th century, the life and works of Phillis Wheatley Peters were reinvigorated by American anti-slavery activists who sought to abolish bondage once and for all. This is the title page of the 1838 edition of A Biography of and Poems by Wheatley, published by the Boston printer and bookseller Isaac Knapp, and the third of 4 editions brought out between 1838 and 1864. By calling attention to Wheatley's status as both a native African and a slave, this title page alludes to the dismembered families and broken communities that bondage left in its wake. The epigraph, which quotes the second and final quatrain of Wheatley's famous poem on being brought from Africa to America, is an extraordinary testament to the poet's boldness, wit, and mastery of tone. Epigraphs of 19th century books and memoirs by formerly enslaved African Americans often quoted Old Testament prophets such as Jeremiah, Amos, or Isaiah, who admonished their listeners to mend their self-serving ways and give succor and hope to the poor and outcast, lest they perish with all their wealth and treasures at the hands of an angry God. Or such title page epigraphs would cite 18th century British anti-slavery writings, such as William Cooper's famous assertion in his 1785 poem, The Task, that slaves cannot breathe in England, which called out the American Republic for its hypocrisy in espousing life and liberty, yet stealing the lives and denying the freedom of the people it enslaved. This edition substitutes God and Cooper with the voice of a native African and slave who is not supposed to imagine such verses or to embrace the Christian religion because of her race and nativity. Yet she has written lines of such enduring power and persuasion that they give lie to the stereotypes underpinning both. This subversive strategy anticipates what the formerly enslaved Harriet Jacobs would accomplish over 20 years later. In her memoir, Incidents in the Life of a Slave Girl, published in Boston in 1860 and reprinted the next year in London as The Deeper Wrong, Jacobs would include as a title page epigraph alongside the words of the prophet Isaiah, her own oracular statement to white northern women about Black women's vulnerability to sexual violence in slavery. To foreground Wheatley's words on the title page is to focus readers' attention on her power to speak for herself and on the urgency now for subsequent generations to speak and write effectively in order to advance the anti-slavery cause. This frontispiece engraving, which precedes the title page, also ascribes value and validity to Wheatley's African American and female literary voice. The plate makers Light and Horton have moved the euphemistic description of the poet as the servant to Mr. John Wheatley of Boston from around her image as it graced her 1773 book of poems to below it. This rearrangement has the effect of making more prominent, in spite of her enslavement, Wheatley's agency and imagination as a writer. These meanings are visually broadcast and facilitated here by her right hand that moves her pen across the page, the book that ostensibly contains her poems resting on the table, and her left hand that draws our gaze upwards to her eyes. Her figure avoids the impertinence of gazing directly at white readers, yet nonetheless suggests an active, curious mind riveted by stimulating thoughts. Knapp's own thoughts about Wheatley's poems underscore my observations. In an 1838 catalog of anti-slavery works for sale at his bookstall, Knapp stated that many of Wheatley's poems would do credit to a person of the highest advantages. He encouraged readers to have them always at hand, that we may have some conception of the amount of genius that slavery is murdering. A co-founder of the New England Anti-Slavery Society, Isaac Knapp was by the late 1830s a major publisher of anti-slavery titles for children and adults, such as Narratives of Enslavement by Equiano, Charles Ball, and Joanna, held in bondage in Suriname, a South American country colonized by the Dutch. Knapp's bookstall at 25 Cornhill was just doors away from the 21 Cornhill offices of William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator, the largest circulating American anti-slavery paper, which Knapp actually printed between 1831 and 1839. In the pages of the Liberator for 1832, as the scholar Max Cavich writes, Garrison and Knapp reprinted most of Wheatley's previously published poems. When Knapp died in his 30s from the effects of alcohol abuse, his friend Garrison eulogized him in the Anti-Slavery Standard as a faithful coadjutor of the anti-slavery cause, a cause indebted to him for what he did and suffered in its behalf. Knapp's publications during the 1830s exemplify how 19th century activism and reform movements benefited from the participation of American women to raise funds, recruit members, advance policies, and change institutions. In 1838 specifically, Knapp printed, reprinted, or sold titles by American women that argued against slavery and or for women's equality, including Sarah Grimke's Letters on the Equality of the Sexes and the Condition of Women, and Lydia Maria Child's Appeal in Favor of that Class of Americans called Africans. In the context of 19th century activism, the lone figure of Wheatley at her desk therefore became a symbol of the collective power to end systems of oppression accomplished by women who worked together, who connected across differences of class and race, and who lifted their voices as one. Knapp includes a memoir written by Margaretta Matilda Odell, a relative of the Wheatleys, which downplays the odiousness of slavery and compliments the Wheatley family for nurturing and championing Wheatley's art. Yet his edition then returns to themes of empowerment, voice, and collective action with the inclusion of the poems of George Moses Horton, then enslaved in North Carolina. By ending with Horton, this book finally signals an unbroken struggle for African American liberation, whose positive outcome is assured by the powers of these writers, Wheatley, Horton, to galvanize readers to action across regions, genders, races, and time. And now I'm going to hand this over to my colleague, Sarah Ruffing Robbins.
Thank you, Barbara. I'm going to now share my screen, and it may take a moment to get to. So, Phillis Wheatley Peters and material memory. To extend my colleague Barbara McCaskill's discussion of Wheatley Peters being repurposed for 19th century anti-slavery writings, I will illustrate how textual afterlives of the author, as seen in AAS holdings, crossed over into the early 20th century. My examples showed this Wheatley Peters doing cultural work supporting construction of printed Black histories and literary resources to counter Jim Crow era hegemony, while also fostering cross-racial alliances. I'm going to be drawing on material memories seen in 3 limited edition texts published by Charles Hartman in 1915. And if you'll go 2 slides down, that would be great. Yeah. These are the texts. Phillis Wheatley Peters, a critical attempt on bibliography of her writing, 6 broadsides related to Phillis Wheatley Peters, and 3rd, Hartman's edition of Wheatley Peters' poems and letters. And you go to the next slide. And one more. Hartman, a German immigrant by way of London, had an initial struggling bootstraps U.S. work history that included being terribly underpaid as a newspaper reporter and tenement janitor before launching a publishing career. Perhaps his own rise through literacy promoted a feeling of kinship with Wheatley Peters, despite their obvious differences. In his 1915 publications, we see examples of the kind of print networks that Jacqueline Jones Royster's Traces in a Stream called on us actually decades ago to revisit. Tracking material signs of these text-based communities resonates with recent work by Joanna Brooks and Tara Bynum on literacy networks on Wheatley Peters. Hartman's 6 Broadsides collection literally makes material memory visible. First, the choice of assembling broadsides signals a wish to expand public appreciation of Wheatley Peters beyond her single 1773 book to other genres addressing diverse local audiences, often for highly context-specific purposes, such as comforting a grieving family. Second, though he uses a parenthetical and a smaller font, Hartman's added designation of Phillis Peters calls on readers to affirm her free married identity, especially given the dropout there of her enslaving family's Wheatley name. Next slide. Another marker of memory making through textual circulation appears in the donor announcement. Here we learn that Hartman gifted this copy to the AAS in the 1915 year of publication. We see this link re-emphasized in his handwritten note on another front matter page where, as collector editor, he signs with compliments to a listing of the various sources from where the broadsides came. While one, designated number 2, is owned by the AAS, others come from the Library Company of Philadelphia, the Pennsylvania Historical Society, the New York Historical Society, and the Connecticut Historical Society. The listing models an ideal of cross-institutional collaboration toward communal knowledge making. In thanking, quote, these libraries for their courtesy and allowing this reproduction, Hartman underscores the part that such archival spaces play in maintenance of otherwise potentially lost resources for honoring Black culture makers. Next slide. Hartman doesn't offer rationale for how and why he's chosen these particular texts. We can draw some inferences, however. Recirculating the Honorable Thomas Hubbard, Esquire, on the death of Mrs. Thankful Leonard recovers an earlier version of an elegy that had also appeared later with revisions in her 1773 book. There, it was titled To the Honorable T.H. Esquire on the death of his daughter. Hartman's reprinting of the earlier version re-emphasizes Wheatley Peters' role as an artist writing for local communities and their needs before her internationally published book. Similarly, by closing his collection with a page of Wheatley Peters' own handwriting, he reminds readers of her personhood and her writings as inscribed processes grounded in lived individual agency. Next slide. Further, by including Jupiter Hammond's poetic address to Miss Phillis Wheatley, Ethiopian princess, Hartman affirms her connections to broader networks of literacy exchange than readers of her London published and white managed book might have grasped. Hammond's poem alerts 1915 readers of this mini anthology that beyond appreciating her work and appreciating her book, it's time to situate Wheatley Peters in a larger, multifaceted cultural repository of African and African-American global cultures. Next slide. Another of Hartman's 1915 limited edition publications clearly sought to enact similarly expansive cultural stewardship. Here's the complete title: Phillis Wheatley, Phillis Peters, Poems and Letters, first collected edition, edited by Charles Fred Hartman, with an appreciation by author Schomburg. Schomburg stands out immediately given his vital contributions to constructing African-American literary heritage, as seen in the New York Research Center bearing his name. And Hartman's connection to Schomburg helped enable that history building, as we can see in the next 2 images. In 1916, as part of his bibliographic Americana series, Hartman would publish Schomburg's bibliographical checklist of American Negro poetry. A substantial section of the checklist, if you'll go to the next slide, is a 6-page listing of Hartman's own bibliography of Wheatley's writings. And the synergy connecting the work of these men and the work they did to foster Black women's writing doesn't end there. Next slide. One of the copies of the Hartman edited 1915 Poems and Letters actually made its way to Alice Dunbar Nelson. According to an online exhibition on Dunbar Nelson, her copy was, quote, warmly inscribed in Spanish by Arturo Alfonso Schomburg to Dunbar Nelson. Thus, we can document how Hartman's and Schomburg's curatorial work enabled an African-American woman writer to immerse in a foremother's literary legacy, next slide, by reading texts such as His Excellency General Washington. That poem, published originally in 1775, after the 1773 book, was reprinted, as we see here, in Hartman's 1915 collection. Next slide. Subsequently, Dunbar Nelson would herself connect the cultural capital of the first US president with the legacy of Wheatley Peters through this same text. The Dunbar speaker and entertainer again reprinted the Washington poem. As a Black woman editor embracing pedagogical responsibilities for her race, Dunbar Nelson underscored her anthology's cultural leadership aims in the dedication. There, she envisioned her collection as enabling, quote, children of the race to read and learn about their own people. Next slide. From material memories of Wheatley Peters passed on through Hartman and Schomburg, Dunbar Nelson drew a powerful culture-shaping resource. Now, relatedly, our project, The Genius of Phillis Wheatley Peters, aims to retrace those legacies operating across time with essential support from partners like the AAS. So I'm now going to turn it over to one of those partners, Ashley.
Hello, actually, I'm going to go first. I'm Elizabeth Pope, curator of books here at AAS, and I'm going to ask Amanda to start our document camera so we can show you some materials from our collections. We've been tracing so far the story of Phillis Wheatley Peters' memory and her words being passed through the 19th and the 20th century, through among many hands, all the way through to, so I wanted to bring us to the 21st century by looking closely at some of the collections at the American Antiquarian Society. Starting with these three examples of the 1773 first edition of poems that you've heard talked about today, printed in London. And I encourage you to take a look and think about why we might have three copies of the same first edition. I will say there is a long and complicated history to institutional collecting, and I'm particularly grateful to Honorée Jeffers for indicating some of that history, but Ashley and I could talk about this for at least an hour, and that's why they put us last. So we're happy to talk about it more if the subject comes up in question and answer. For now, suffice it to say, the caretaking work that we do at AAS is based on and deeply informed by the work of earlier generations. Black bibliographers like Dorothy Porter Wesley, and scholars, some of whom you've heard speaking with us today, have kept Wheatley Peters' memory alive, and they're now adding new perspectives on her work and her life. Similarly, early generations of AAS staff conserved Wheatley Peters' materials, as you see here, including this first edition with this beautiful spine here, which I think is the volume that Honorée Jeffers mentioned holding. Among the most recent edition is this third copy of poems, given this fall by a former AAS staff member, Nancy Burkett, and her husband, curator and scholar of African Americana, Rand Burkett. Now, there are three main reasons for these three copies. AAS's collection development policy encourages keeping multiple copies if there are variants between them. And unfortunately, I don't think we're going to be able to get close enough to really make it entirely clear, but I will say there are variants here in this frontispiece portrait. One copy, one state of this has cross-hatching behind Phillis Wheatley Peters' head, and so that's this one. And one does not have that cross-hatching. So if you can zoom in really close on your camera or your whatever you're on, you might be able to see that difference. There are a number of other different differences in these states, but that will have to suffice for the moment. The potential fragility of material memory also can be seen in these 3 copies. And maybe we can zoom out a little more. Having more than one copy allows us to loan out or to use in classes copies that otherwise the wear and tear might cause significant issues with. So we have this first copy that I'm holding, which is in a fairly pristine, for surviving since the 18th century, original binding with the Morocco red lettering piece here with gilt on the spine. And this has a AAS conservation file on the minimal treatment that was done to it and an AAS librarian's note in it saying to be kept because of its fine condition. And so we are keeping this copy for that reason. There's also a rebacked use copy here that is, you can see here, it's been rebacked. This is, you can tell the difference in the leather there. This has 18th or 19th century handwritten annotations throughout, including one in the rear here. The earliest attribution, I believe, that one of these poems of Phillis Wheatley Peters to SM, a young African painter, was actually referring to Scipio Moorhead, the artist who may have painted the portrait that this frontispiece is based on. So this copy, the second copy, has been well used and continues to be used when classes visit. The third copy here came to us only this fall. And you'll see it has also presumably been well loved and read. It has sewing in its binding here. We call that sometimes vernacular sewing. It wasn't done by a professional bookbinder. It was done by somebody who owned the book, usually. Also, if we zoom in, and I'm actually just going to put another piece of paper behind here so it's a little more clear. Actually, let's use this tab. The title page on this example does have some significant losses. And you can see one of those losses is part of Phillis's name there. However, this copy makes up for that loss on the verso, where you can see that Phillis has actually signed this copy, Phillis Wheatley, which was her maiden name, her name at the time. We know from letters that Phillis signed copies shipped to America for sale because she was afraid that unscrupulous printers might reprint the volume, and she wanted to mark the genuine copies. So this copy presumably was sold in America. It may even have been one of the copies sold to the Black community by Wheatley Peters' friend Ober Tanner, who we know sold some of her works in the Black community in Newport, or perhaps by the Mohegan leader and cleric Samson Occam, an acquaintance who also functioned as a bookseller of her book. So each of these copies, if we can zoom out again, has a different story to tell. One is in pristine condition, speaking to the high cultural value placed on Wheatley Peters' work. Second and third copies place her work more firmly in her Black community. The second copy, heavily annotated and used, names Scipio Moorhead as the Black portraitist. The third copy, signed her name, was certainly sold in America and possibly by people of color functioning as book agents for Wheatley Peters' work, presumably getting this volume or one like it into the hands of other Indigenous or Black New Englanders. But perhaps the most powerful, to my mind, part of this third copy is the juxtaposition here of these two pages. And we can zoom in further on those. As far as I've been able to determine, this is only found in this copy because it has been misbound, so that this leaf, which should have appeared a few pages back here, is instead right up front. And this, to the public, is an attestation or an authorization by more than a dozen gentlemen. And it was supposed to provide the proof that Wheatley Peters' poems were genuine and that she was qualified to write them. That's in quotes from there. However, in this copy, directly opposite these gentlemen's names is her signature. It's Phillis Wheatley self-authorizing her poems as a genuine copy. And to use Wheatley Peters' words, calling it a genuine copy to use Wheatley Peters's words. Her name in this place where the copyright information would go indicates her ownership of both her work and her words. And I'm going to pass things over now to my colleague, Ashley Cataldo.
So now we're in for a rather whirlwind tour of Wheatley Peters in the 19th century. So I hope this will help us to see some of the materials that we've heard about for the past half hour or so. So we'll start out with manuscript poems. These are original, and I hope these are visible to you on the document cam. This is a very small collection of original manuscript poems by Wheatley Peters. These poems, you can see there at the University of Cambridge and on the death of the Reverend Dr. Sewell, one dated 1767 and the other 1769. We believe that these poems came to the American Antiquarian Society when a former librarian, Christopher Columbus Baldwin, retrieved a collection of books and pamphlets from the home of Thomas Walcott. Walcott had been a correspondent of Wheatley Peters, and Walcott's handwriting is actually on the back of one of these poems, which you can see here. So 1830s, these poems come to the American Antiquarian Society. Also as part of this manuscript collection is one individual signature, Phillis Wheatley. 19th century autograph collectors would often cut out individual autograph signatures from manuscripts. Perhaps this one even came from a copy of Wheatley Peters' book, as Elizabeth had mentioned earlier. We also have at AAS copies of the Massachusetts Spy. The 1830s encounter with manuscripts, with Wheatley Peters manuscripts, was not the first encounter that AAS folks had with manuscripts that were created by Wheatley Peters, as Honorée mentioned earlier in the hour. Before AAS was even founded, AAS founder and printer publisher Isaiah Thomas and his partner Ebenezer Andrews were approached by John Peters to publish a second edition of Wheatley Peters' works. You can see here a prospectus for that second volume of poetry. This is from 1791. The second volume of poetry has become of great interest to scholars like Joseph Resnick and Nina Dayton, and also Honorée speaks wonderfully and beautifully of this in her book. So please go revisit that as well. We also have evidence that the collecting at AAS continued. So you'll see here, actually we have some late 18th and early 19th century editions of Wheatley Peters' poems. One is from 1802 and actually has the book plate, of Isaiah Thomas, whose newspaper we were just looking at and where the prospectus for that second volume of poems appeared. But all of these editions you can see are in different kinds of bindings. And two of these editions from 1816 and I believe from 1804 are in much finer bindings. These would have come to the American Antiquarian Society in the later part of the 19th century. These came from the library of a collector named George Brindley, and these are from the Brindley Library. Okay, so, and that would have been in the 1870s in case you're curious about a date. The 1830s, again, this is when we received those copies of Phillis Wheatley Peters' manuscript poems. The 1830s was an interesting period for reprinting Wheatley Peters' works. And you heard about this in Barbara's talk, that this is going to be a little bit difficult, so bear with me for a moment. If Elizabeth, maybe you could help me just to, so this doesn't get damaged. Barbara mentioned that many of Wheatley Peters' poems were reprinted in the Liberator in 1832. And this is one example from April of that year, where we see Wheatley Peters' poems appearing throughout, I believe, the first half of 1832 in almost every issue of the Liberator. And you can see, I just wanted to show this so you could actually see how the poems were laid out on the page, and they usually appear in every issue in this left-hand column. Okay, I did say this would be whirlwind. The 1830s also saw the publication of the what we are calling the Odell Memoir. And I have multiple editions of this. We have the 1834, 35, 38, and 64. During that same year, 1834, we have, and I'll show the title page of this one, we have the Benjamin Busey Thatcher Memoir of Phillis Wheatley as well. All of these editions by what we at one point thought was authored by Odell contain contain poems of Wheatley Peters. The Thatcher children's book contains poems throughout. So there are reprintings of Wheatley Peters poems throughout the children's book as well. And I'll just show you the title page of that 1834 Odell memoir so you can get a sense of what that looks like. And I think you saw the 1838 in Barbara's talk. And there we go. And you can see on the title page here, there is no actual author listed. Okay, and now we want to zip forward to the 1840s, 50s, and a portion of the 1860s. In 1848, Wheatley Peters' poems appear in an edition, actually this went through multiple editions, of Caroline May's American Female Poets. Again, there's a very brief biographical statement taken from the Odell memoir, and also several poems are reprinted. In the 1850s, William C. Nell publishes a biographical statement, and I should have this in a cradle. Let me just put this in a cradle so I'm handling this properly. So Nell actually publishes this brief biographical statement of Wheatley Peters. As far as I can tell, there was no poetry published in this book, which is The Colored Patriots of the American Revolution. In 1863, William Wells Brown includes a biographical statement and poetry by Wheatley Peters in his book, The Black Man. And in 1855, a little bit earlier than the William Wells Brown title, Everett Dykink publishes in his Encyclopedia of American Literature, and I'll pull out the correct volume here, in the Encyclopedia of American Literature. I'll just show you the spine so I don't put this in too small of a cradle. A really lengthy biographical statement on Wheatley Peters, as well as, actually, let me just grab a cradle that fits this. Publishes a biographical statement as well as poems by Wheatley Peters. And what's interesting about the Dykink book is that the Encyclopedia of American Literature is that he borrows poems, these manuscript poems that came to AAS in the 1830s. He actually borrows those and transcribes them exactly in this Encyclopedia of American Literature. Okay. And then finally, in the 1860s, and I think we'll somewhat conclude there, we have a real soaring of antiquarian interest in Wheatley Peters. Charles Dean of the Massachusetts Historical Society comes out with an edition of the letters of Phillis Wheatley, calling her Phillis Wheatley. Charles Dean also writes to the American Antiquarian Society, and I think Honorée will be happy to know this. In writing to the AAS, Charles Dean is requesting information about manuscripts that are contained in our copy of the 1773 poems. He's requesting information about our original manuscripts, but he also implies that B.B. Thatcher, Benjamin Busey Thatcher, who authored that children's book, is also the author of the Odell memoir. And you'll have to go back and read Honorée's book in order to get a little bit more information about some of the controversy surrounding the authorship of the Odell memoir. But I think she'll be happy to know that in 1863, Charles Dean also suspected that Benjamin Busey Thatcher was the author of the Odell memoir. And just to conclude, by the 1870s and 1880s, Wheatley Peters' works were appearing at auctions of revolutionary material and in antiquarian bookshops. And I can sort of open this up so you have something to look at. But to me, it seems like she's so different from others who were, shall I say, relegated to antiquarian bookstores and libraries. I don't know about you, but for me, she seems to be so very much alive. We've talked a lot about historical sort of memory, and remembering her through library collections. And those who have such a presence in our historical memory seem to do so for, I think, a reason. Maybe we're not remembering her in the way she hoped to be remembered. Maybe we're remembering her too much or not enough, or just not in the right ways. So I think we'll just have to keep on remembering her until we get it right. So thank you.
Wonderful. Well, thank you. Thank you, everyone, for all of your presentations. This has been really a wonderful whirlwind tour of Phillis Wheatley Peters. So much to think about, and to think about the continuing interest in Wheatley Peters. We have some time now for questions, and I want to remind everyone that you're welcome to put your questions in the Q&A. And while you're doing that, I wanted to start by just asking some questions of our two curators here and our panelists as well. We know that there are a lot of students who are in the audience who may be interested in pursuing a future work within the humanities. And so we thought it might be nice just to start by asking Ashley and Elizabeth about how they got started and how they came to have the privilege of working with materials related to Phillis Wheatley Peters. So we might just start by taking a few minutes to ask if you would each be willing to say a few words about your own background in this work.
Sure. So my background, I came to this as someone who loved English and history. Growing up, yeah. And I couldn't choose which to focus on. Growing up, I started out working, my first job was at the local library because I could walk there, and I was 14. That was the first time you were allowed to work. So it was an interest I had early on. And when I realized that people studied books in a historical context, I realized that was for me. So my degree is in history. I was working towards the PhD, but ended up working at AAS instead. And I think for me, it's such a privilege to work with these materials, but I really feel like being able to connect scholars to the materials that they base their work on and the stories that we tell, not only scholars, but poets, artists, people on the street, the general public, having these sources gives something to come back to, a touchstone. And so it's a real honor for me working in this way, being a small part of scholarship.
Yeah, I mean, my story is very much the same as Elizabeth's. Have a background in English and history and just really loved doing the work. And actually, Honorée was one of the first fellows during my time at AAS. And I think the excitement that was present in the reading room when Honorée was around was just so inspirational. And I think helped us all to see Wheatley Peters in a completely new light. And I think that's one of the things that in getting into library work and particularly curatorial work is that sort of adapting to new ways of doing things, adapting to new historical methodologies is just, the humanities work really provides you with that kind of foundation to really be able to change with new scholarship that's being done, new ways of looking at things. And it's certainly benefited, I think, both of us here in work at AAS.
Yeah, and the ability to be flexible in your thinking and understand things that you've done wrong, as well.
Absolutely.
There's a lot, there's not one way to do things.
Absolutely.
And I think all of us in archives and libraries are thinking, very carefully about the work that we're doing in new ways. And it's because of the work of scholars like those speaking today that really have, pushed us, and we appreciate it.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, well, great. Thank you. Professor Jeffers, would you like to address the question about how you got started in the humanities and also your interest in Wheatley Peters?
Well, I too was an English major. People are like, you need to go into STEM, but English majors are fantastic. We can do anything, right? So I started off as an English major. I also attended 2 historically Black colleges first Clark College, which is now Clark Atlanta University, before transferring to Talladega College in Alabama. And that's where I first encountered the poetry of Phillis Wheatley Peters, who we then referred to as Phillis Wheatley. And then in 2003, I read this fabulous excerpt from Dr. Gates's book, The Trials of Phillis Wheatley. And it was in the New Yorker, and I just got sucked in and I couldn't let it go. I'm giving the Cliff's Notes version here. And then Natasha Trethewey, who I don't know how she had heard of the AAS, but she said, "Ooh, girl, you should apply for their artist fellowship, to do more work." Phillis Wheatley Peters, or Phillis Wheatley, that's how we referred to her then. And when I showed up, oh my God, I just love these ladies so much. I can't even tell you, I just love them so much. And they were so sweet and helpful, but also really interested in my confusion when I was going through the Odell memoir, like, this is not adding up. And it just kept the Odell memoir. That's what I always say, right? And they, and then Miss Caroline Sloat, she hates that I call her Miss Caroline, but it's just a Southern thing. And she was just really insistent that I look at myself as a non-traditional scholar, not simply a poet. She just, when I would flub a date, she would say, "Be careful, you're a historian." And it was, that kind of validation. And also now why I insist when people say, "Well, Honorée's a poet," I'm like, no, I'm a scholar. Right. I spent 15 years in these archives. And so now my biggest thing is, and then I'll wrap up, is that from time to time, I will go back and do, even though I'm working on 3 books right now, but I will go back and try to find information about what is the relationship between Benjamin Bussey Thatcher and Margaretta Matilda Odell, because Kara Glatt published an essay. We sort of crossed, ships crossing in the night. The Age of Phillis came out in March 2020. She had published an essay in early American literature in January 2020, saying, and to her mind, and that's okay, this is a settled, issue that Odell wrote it. But one of the things that she mentioned that I feel needs to be explored is that Odell left money in her will to Benjamin Bussey Thatcher's mama. Now, I don't know how y'all feel, but I was like, were they lovers? Were they, what was happening there, And so I've done research at the Clements Library, which has the American Colonization Society, a lot of their stuff. And I found correspondence, and of course, this is, slipping my mind, to Benjamin Bussey Thatcher, but it's still not from Odell, but that's about it. So I'm just hoping, some, really fastidious, nosy graduate student, starts going in there, because I don't think this story is settled at all. And we still have not found the provenance for Odell. We have a footnote where somebody says something, and you're like, the way I was trained by the great Caroline Sloat, that is not proof, right? I can say I'm the Queen of England, but but that doesn't prove anything. So I'm waiting on that, and I'm still really excited. I see so much work, the work that's being done by the panelists here. I'm just like, it's exciting to me because Miss Phillis deserves this. She is worthy.
Yeah, there certainly is a lot coming out and a lot more to come out and always more to be learned and discovered. Well, we have questions coming in. Sarah and Barbara, if you want to weigh in, you're welcome to. I want to make sure we get to questions that are coming through. So feel free to turn on your videos so that you can, yes, good. You'd like to.
Let's go to those questions, Nan.
Let's go to those questions. So Terry Marsh is asking, saying, thank you, amazing presentation. Do you know whose collection the annotated copy was in, or perhaps multiple previous owners? Elizabeth is pulling up her.
So we can, if we can turn the doc cam on again. So the annotated copy here, if we zoom in, there's a Dan, for short for Daniel, Dan period O'Connor, but you can see that there's been some damage here. So that's a bit of a challenge. There's also another ownership signature here, KB Stratford, who is apparently gave this copy to the AAS, and who you will note here, his uncle was Thomas Walcott. So there are connections all throughout this. But yeah, more work needs to be done on determining all of the provenance and looking at all of the inscriptions. There are little, pieces of pricing, it looks like, being added up. And my favorite was, let me see if I can find this. Here we have, can you see that on there? A little drawing that is mimicking the portrait there. So these annotations are not just text. There are other responses recorded in this book.
Yeah.
So exciting.
That is exciting. It's fascinating to see that. And while you're doing that, Elizabeth, I just want you to address a question that Marie is asking about. She's curious about why gloves are not worn when touching these books and manuscripts. Don't the oils in the hands affect the pages?
Great question. So we say all the time, clean, dry hands. That's what the books want. If you wear gloves, there's decreased sensitivity, and it's actually easier to damage or chip a page than the damage that might come from a little bit of oil. So clean, dry hands is the professional standard for books and manuscripts.
Great, thank you. Here's a question that anyone can jump in and address if they'd like. Roshan is asking, thank you for sharing the resources. Question is there any collection of correspondence between Phillis Wheatley Peters and Benjamin Rush? I don't know if anyone is aware of.
Not that I know.
I'm not aware.
Doesn't mean it's not there.
Right.
but-
It doesn't mean it's not and somebody's at it,
Yeah.
and hopefully the mice are not nibbling on it.
So Sean is asking, can you confirm the estimated number of first editions in existence of various subjects, the religion and moral? I thought I had heard that he thought only 25 ever existed, or was that?
No, they're quite a bit more than that. I don't know the total number. I mean, there's at least a dozen that have her signature on the verso that I was just showing. We are not the only people to have that. She was obviously signing multiple copies to sell them in America. So there are at least a dozen of those. Many major institutions have holdings for Wheatley poems. So I would guess over 100, but that's just a total guess.
I do not know the total number.
Yeah, I probably shouldn't guess.
For the
Okay.
Hartman limited edition, the three texts that I referenced today, the poems, there were only 25 printed. So that's one reason it's so special to discover that one got to Alice Dunbar Nelson. The other two, one has as many as 400. And the one I didn't talk about today, I chose not to talk about because it's widely available online. There are many digital copies, Happy Trust and Internet Archives. So I tried to focus on the ones that might be harder, for people to get to, unless they were lucky to go to the AUS like Barbara and I were in October and look at the material. So
I don't do print. I always tell people I don't do print history. I think everybody has their little niche, right? And mine is Africana kinship and lineage.
One step I would recommend the person that asked that question to take, check out the WorldCat database online. That would be one quick way just to get an idea of how many editions are out there. I don't know how granular it would be in describing which libraries have first editions, but for the uninitiated, WorldCat is always a great place to begin when looking for books, early books, who has them, how accessible they are. You can find out a lot of information sometimes just by looking at those notes.
Great. And the ESTC, I'll also put in a plug for, because it's more specific just to English language publication, and yeah.
And the AAS catalog.
Yeah.
Yes, the catalog is pretty great for getting information. We have lots of questions here. I'm just sort of picking through in a hurry to select some. We probably won't get to all of them, but Jacqueline is asking, after thank you, it's a great presentation. A question for the panel at large, but specifically Professor McCaskill, can you speak about Phillis Wheatley Peters' afterlife during the first phase of New Negro print culture of the 1880s and 90s? Thinking with Professor McCaskill's periodization concept of postbellum pre-Harlem, how do the poems and the concept of Wheatley Peters as a poet-author circulate and or evolve as the 19th century ends and the 20th century begins?
Oh, that's a wonderful question, and it gives me an excellent idea for a next research project. I've been working with my longtime collaborator and fellow scholar on the postbellum pre-Harlem journey, Caroline Gebhard, on a collection of original essays for the African American Literature in Translation series. And our beat, of course, is 1880 to 1900. And although none of our contributors are exploring Wheatley specifically, what I can tell you is that there was plenty of awareness about Wheatley, canon building involving Wheatley. You've already seen the archivist gesture to many anthologies. Certainly, they were apparent in the 1880s, 1890s. I would be curious about this, and I don't know what the answer to the question is, but one place to begin to answer this question that we don't always go to, that Caroline and I are insisting that we go to, along with other scholars like Gabrielle Foreman, John Ernest, we need to look at the newspapers. 1880s, 1890s, this was a brilliant moment for the production of African-American newspapers. And I would venture those newspapers, in celebrating the coming wave and the current wave, I should say, of Black writers, also were looking back to their influences. The major African-American newspapers, the New York Age, for example, the Indianapolis Freeman, always had literature and culture sections. So one place to begin to answer that question, beyond looking at anthologies, which we know were being published by African-Americans for African-Americans, another place to look, and a place that I would encourage anyone who is curious about this period's relationship to Wheatley to look, is to the African-American newspapers. How were those newspapers positioning Wheatley as a progenitor of the coming wave, but also as someone who was in conversation with the ginormous amount of African-American playwriting, novel writing, poetry writing? How was she in conversation during that time? I love that question because it invites us to think of how postbellum pre-Harlem literature, African-American literature of the 1880s and the 1890s, was dynamized by art because it drew from these earlier writers. And I have to admit that I and so many of my colleagues are more inclined to look back to Douglas's influence or Harper's influence on this next generation after the Civil War than we are to go back to the 18th century. But we need to do that. Another place to look, and I'm just thinking out loud here, I might steal this idea, so you better start writing. Another place to look would be the slave narratives. I like to call them the fugitive narratives. Narratives of formerly enslaved persons were being published well into the 20th century. And another place that too often as scholars we've been remiss in studying this period, the 1880s, 1890s, the slave narrative genre of this period. Why am I recommending that you look at slave narratives to think about Phillis Wheatley? Because always the writers of fugitive narratives paid homage to other Black writers. Even if it was only in a chapter, okay, my fellow scholars nodding, or a footnote, or an allusion to an allusion. But you can find the ghosts of early African-American writers haunting, in a good way, not a bad way, haunting the literature of formerly enslaved people of the 1880s, 1890s, and 1900s. And that could give you a clue as well to Phillis Wheatley's afterlives during that period. Wonderful question, great idea. We're going to be on it.
Nan, I am watching some of the things going by in the chat, and I just want to pick up on a couple of things that have shown up there. One, there was a question about biography, and this is a great opportunity for me to forecast that on April 3rd, we'll be hearing through the project that we're coordinating. There's going to be a webinar with Vince Coretta talking about his brand new updated biography published by University of Georgia Press. So go to the website and you can register and you can hear about why it was necessary to update the biography. I just met with him on Zoom this morning. I can't wait for that session. And then April 4th, there's going to be a roundtable of scholars literally from around the world responding to the new biography. So if you want to know more about biography, those two things would be great to come to. And then to the question about children's lit, and there was a reference to Bridget Fielder's wonderful work that she's doing. Come in October, we're going to have a wonderful session in October on children's lit engagement and young adult lit engagement with Wheatley Peters. And I put the link to the LibGuide that Library has created that has a lot of information about children's narratives and young adult narratives depicting and responding to Wheatley. So come to the events that are still on the calendar, number one, and number two, check out the resources. We'll be adding more and more resources to the website. To the point about dramatic presentations, we have an interview with Ada Solanke, whose new play on Wheatley is in process, and that interview is going to be projected in 3 podcasts. I got to listen to some of the raw material, and so that's coming soon. So keep visiting the website for the project. There's going to be more and more stuff there that will be addressing your questions.
Great, thank you. Yes, I'm glad you were able to point out some of those upcoming programs in the series that you all are, and especially the names that you referenced. I know that Bridget is coming up, and certainly Vince Coretta. So that's great. Lots to look forward to. And man, I wish we had more time to address some of these questions, but this has been really fantastic to just to kind of dip in a little bit into all that there is to be said about Phillis Wheatley Peters. I want to thank all of you for your great participation and contributions here. This has been really fabulous. We have to end before too long. The library will closing on us, so we need to wrap up, but I want to also let everyone know about upcoming programs at the AAS. You can go to our website to learn more and to register for those programs. But we have, for instance, tomorrow afternoon at 2 p.m., you can join us for a book talk by Lloyd Pratt on his book, The Stranger's Book, The Human of African American Literature. And then we have a series of programs in April. The first in April on the 6th will be a talk by Katie Walkowitz on her book, Reading Territory, Indigenous and Black Freedom, Removal, and the 19th Century State. She'll be in conversation with Lisa Brooks, Professor of English and American Studies at Amherst College. So lots to look forward to. Please go to our website to see those upcoming programs. And thank you all for being here and for introducing us to all the programs that you have yet coming up in your series. Thank you, everyone, and thank you to our audience for joining us today.